Well, the year was 1972, and I was lost in a muddle of tiny Cambridge streets looking for Divinity Avenue, where my dorms was supposedly located. I felt a little lost myself, wondering what I was about to get myself into as a divinity student. Somehow the word divinity never really seemed to apply to me. I never had what I would consider a definitive call to ministry, and so I regarded it all more as an adventure or maybe a trial for a year just to see how it goes. Nowadays, a GPS would have helped me find Divinity Avenue, but back then it was just luck that I caught a street sign out of the corner of my eye, made a quick left turn, and immediately saw another sign that stood perpendicular to Divinity Avenue, which said, "Dead end." Great, and I thought, what am I doing here anyway? I got settled into my dorm, put a six-pack of beer in the communal fridge, and by evening, when I felt that the beer would be nicely chilled, I opened the fridge. It was gone. They don't share very well in Divinity School, I thought. A bunch of guys were hanging around the kitchen table, so I went to introduce myself, and I said I really didn't mind sharing my beer, but I wish someone had at least left me one can to enjoy. Well, they looked at me a little puzzled. They shrugged their shoulders, not knowing what to make of all this, when one guy named Bill, I later learned he was training to be a Methodist minister, responded unapologetically, "I threw out the six-pack. There's going to be no alcohol in this refrigerator." I thought, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? Now, this was the first time I lived outside of New York City, and sometimes I guess you just can't take New York out of the boy. And so I went over to my Methodist friend, and I kind of explained things to him, at least the way we explain things in the neighborhood in which I grew up, and beer was never an issue again for the next 3 years. So, now, having been raised a Unitarian since birth, I was one of those humanist types who proudly never opened the Bible for fear that I just might be injected with religious fervor against my will. I never thought about ministry, but even if I had thought about ministry, I don't think I ever would have gotten much past the book of Genesis. I just didn't want any of that. It turned out that my advisor at the Divinity School was the foremost New Testament scholar in the world. So, what am I doing here? This is wrong. It was a great guy. His name was Helmut Kester, and his broad German accent would eventually show me the errors of my biblical illiterate ways. Presbyterian student down the hall, thin, lanky fellow, a booming voice, who bragged about his virginity as much as Tim Tebow does these days. And of course I thought, what am I doing here? Well, he told a bunch of us that he was actually headed to law school when God tapped him on the shoulder and moved him in a whole new direction. I thought, wow, that's what I call a calling. I wish something would tap me anywhere and kind of just make sure that I knew I was headed in the right direction. But in retrospect, perhaps I did receive a call and had slowly followed a path which guided me in spite of myself. As a college sophomore, I took a class called Argumentation and Advocacy. It was really essentially a debating class where we were assigned a topic and we had this adversary we had to go up against and debated an issue. Then the class would vote on a winner and the professor render a grade. Now this was 1968 and I was given probably the hottest issue at that time, namely the legitimacy of the Black Panthers. I was to defend them. At a time, they were mostly perceived by white society as a threat to destabilizing the whole country, and that Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach was the preferred route. So I was there to defend the Black Panthers, and I felt I was truly in my element. I'd grown up in an all-black neighborhood, attended a predominantly black high school. Bob Beeman was one of my classmates, the guy who broke the triple jump world record in the Olympics in Mexico City in '68. And when the TV camera got a shot of, I don't know if you remember, they panned, in fact, they did this often. I don't know how many of you remember the '68 Olympics, but they did pan a lot of the black athletes pumping their fists, kind of a feeling, a symbol of unity. And as they were pumping their fists, I was right there with them. Their anger was my anger, and I just had a close identification with them. So I debated a Mr. Orentreich, and students were always referred to by their last name in those days. And I had him for lunch. We had quite a room full of spectators, mostly because of the nature of the topic. And the audience, when this debate was done, had enthusiastically applauded and noted that I had triumphed. But then everyone was shocked. Needless to say, I was especially shocked when the professor issued a B+ to Mr. Orentreich and a failing grade to me. The professor conceded that I perhaps had the ability to sway opinion, but that, and I quote, Mr. Goldsmith would make a far better Unitarian minister than a debater. Wow. So that was the first time anyone had mentioned my name in the context of ministry. And I approached her after class and asked her, where did that come from? And explained that I was a Unitarian. And she said, well, there you have it. Was this a sign? God, I wish I knew. The following summer in 1969, I attended an international gathering of Unitarian students in England. And through connections, I was fortunate to wind my way down to Prague and stay with the Unitarian minister there, Dr. Kafka. We became fast friends, and so he invited me to deliver the sermon the upcoming Sunday morning. But they don't speak English, Dr. Kafka, I said. And he responded, knowing that I was rather fluent in German. He said that, well, most of the congregation, even though they didn't enjoy hearing or speaking German, most of them knew it and asked me to just deliver the sermon in German. And so I look back now, because I did that, and so my first sermon was delivered at age 20 in German in Prague. Was this a sign? The next summer, while in London, I met a Dr. Catherine Dalton, a Harley Street doctor, and in fact, the very first woman who was president of the British Medical Society. For some reason, she really enjoyed Unitarian youth, and she hung out with us a lot. And in conversation, she asked me what my future plans were, and I said, I really don't know, but somehow ministry seems somewhat awkwardly to have gotten into the picture. "Why, that's splendid," she said. She happened to be the wife of Tom Dalton, the Unitarian minister in London. And she said that her husband, Tom, was having kidney problems. They were looking for someone to fill the pulpit. Would I please have the honors to do that? And foolishly, I said, sure. I mean, I thought I was ahead of the game because I could deliver this sermon in English. And although the Brits didn't quite think it was English, but we were able to communicate nonetheless. I realized that I really liked it a lot, and it felt pretty comfortable.